She didn't cry when she found the will. She sat completely still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. And in that silence, 8 years of mortgage payments, furnace repairs, roof work, and property taxes, all lined up in her mind like a perfect column of numbers. She had a name for the error she'd been making. She had a name for it now. Before I go any further, if you've ever been the person everyone leans on but nobody truly sees, take 1 second and subscribe right now. Because this story was made for you. And you're going to want to stay until the very end. Her name was Paige. She was 34 years old. She was an accountant. And she was about to let the paperwork do what 8 years of silence never could. Paige wasn't the kind of woman who made scenes. She was the kind of woman who kept records. She ran a small bookkeeping firm in a town 40 minutes from where she grew up, 40 clients, 1 rented office, and a reputation for reconciling accounts down to the last penny without breaking a sweat. Numbers were her language. Precision was her instinct. She slept fine at night because she always knew where everything stood. Her parents' home sat on 3 acres just outside a small Ohio town. The kind of town where everyone already knows what truck is parked in whose driveway before the sun comes up. Her father, Raymond, had retired early. Back injuries from a plant job he'd worked his whole life. Her mother, Carol, had never worked outside the home. Together they'd made the kinds of financial decisions a lot of people made during the good years: refinancing, pulling cash out, spending it, refinancing again. And when the market shifted and the payments ballooned, the savings were already gone. Paige got the call on a Tuesday. She was 26 years old. Her mother read the bank's foreclosure letter to her over the phone. Slowly, like a recipe she didn't understand. And Paige drove the 50 minutes out to that house that same night, sat down at the kitchen table under the fluorescent light, and stared at a letter with the word foreclosure printed in plain black ink. The only way to save the house was to refinance. But the bank wouldn't touch 2 retirees with no income and a credit score in the basement. They needed a cosigner. They needed someone with clean credit and a steady business. They needed Paige. The closing attorney, a careful man who'd seen this situation before, wouldn't let her walk in blind. He explained the risk. He structured the deal properly. And when the papers were signed and the deed was recorded, Paige walked out of that office as the primary borrower and the majority owner of the property. Her parents called it paperwork. Her mother called it a blessing. Paige called it keeping a roof over her parents' heads. And for 8 years, she did exactly that. $1,140. Every first of the month. On autopay from her business account. Never missed. Never late. She covered the property taxes. She paid for the new furnace in year 3. She covered the roof in year 6. She even sent money to help her younger brother Eric with rent when her parents asked. Money that somehow became a loan she'd made to her parents, not a gift she'd given him. Her brother Eric lived an hour in the other direction. The distance never seemed to reach his phone. Paige noticed the pattern. She was an accountant. Noticing patterns was the whole job. But every time she gently raised it at a holiday dinner, maybe Eric could chip in, maybe costs could be shared, her mother's face would go soft and wounded. Her father would look up from his plate and say something like, "Families don't nickel and dime each other." And Paige would let it go. Because the loan had her name on it. And walking away meant walking away from her own credit, and from her parents' home. So she stayed. She told herself that being reliable was a compliment. She had no idea it was a job description. Then her father had his heart attack. It was a Sunday in the garden. A tomato cage in his hands. Her mother called Paige before she called the ambulance. That tells you everything about the order of things in that house. Paige drove the 50 minutes in 38. Raymond pulled through. A stent, 4 days in the hospital, a stack of discharge papers that nobody in that house would have read on their own. So Paige read them. She set up his medications in a weekly organizer. She called the cardiologist's office. She learned the difference between a beta blocker and a blood thinner. She became, quietly and without being asked, her father's medical manager. A brush with death makes people want their affairs in order. Her parents decided it was time to write a proper will. Her mother handed Paige a grocery bag full of documents, bank statements, insurance cards, the deed Paige already knew by heart, and asked her to sort and file everything, because Paige was the one who was good at that. So Paige sat at her own kitchen table that night, a glass of wine poured, the bag open in front of her. She went through everything methodically: bank statements, insurance, the deed. And at the very bottom of the bag, in a fresh manila envelope with a law firm's return address, a document she had never been shown. The flap wasn't even sealed. She told herself not to read it. Then she read it anyway. Because Paige was the kind of woman who reads what's in front of her. She had never once been sorry about that habit. Until that night. She read the will the way she read a balance sheet, line by line, looking for her own name. She got to the end. She went back to the beginning. She read it again. Her name appeared exactly once. One sentence. It said that their daughter had been provided for during their lifetime, and therefore would not share in the estate. Everything else, the house, the 3 acres, the truck, the savings account, her mother's jewelry, left entirely to their son. To Eric. Provided for. She had made 96 mortgage payments. They had written her one sentence. And the sentence was about how she'd already gotten enough. Paige didn't cry. She sat very still and felt something reorganize itself inside her. Quiet and final. The way a column of numbers reorganizes when you finally find the error you've been chasing for an hour. She put the will back in its envelope. She filed it neatly, the way she'd been asked. She poured the rest of the wine down the sink, because she wanted to remember this with a clear head. She went to Sunday dinner the following week and said absolutely nothing. She needed to understand it first. The way you need to understand a number before you act on it. That Sunday dinner, the conversation turned, as it always did, to the future of the house. Eric mentioned that he and his fiancée Brittany were thinking about moving in, to help out now that Raymond's health was a concern. Her father nodded along, carving the roast, and said it made sense to keep the place in the family for the next generation. Paige asked, very evenly, what he meant by family. He didn't even look up from the meat. The home goes to the son, he said. That's how it's always been done. He said it like a weather forecast. Her mother reached for the gravy. Eric smiled at his plate like a man who'd just been handed a deed. Nobody in that kitchen knew Paige had read the will. Nobody thought they had to explain it to her. Because in their version of the story, she was the bank. And you don't explain the will to the bank. Paige passed the potatoes. She asked about her father's next cardiology appointment. She drove the 50 minutes home with both hands on the wheel. That one line replayed the whole way. The home goes to the son. She had paid for that home for 8 years. And apparently, she had been paying to give it away. That night, she opened a spreadsheet. She listed everything. Every mortgage payment. Every tax bill. Every repair. Every deposit she'd made into her brother's rent when her parents asked. She added the total. 6 figures. Then she opened a second column. What had she been promised in return? That column was empty. Because there had never been a promise. Only an assumption. And she was the one who had made it. Paige was not a dramatic woman. She wasn't going to make a speech. She wasn't going to send a letter full of wounded paragraphs. She wasn't going to stand in that kitchen and explain how much they'd hurt her, because they would only hear ingratitude, and she would only sound like a bank refusing a loan. So she did the one thing a quiet woman with clean credit can do that lands harder than any speech. She opened her banking app. She found the autopay she had set up 8 years earlier. And she turned it off. No announcement. No warning. No scene. Just silence where a payment used to be. It would take exactly 1 billing cycle for them to hear it. The first few days were strange. Her thumb hovered over that app more than once. 8 years of habit doesn't switch off as cleanly as an autopay does. But she left it off. She went to work. She reconciled her clients' books. She called her father to check on his blood pressure, the way she always did, and said nothing about money. The mortgage came due on the 1st. The 1st came and went. On the 4th, a notice arrived, addressed to Paige, because the loan was hers, that the payment was past due. She read it twice. Set her phone face down. On the 11th, her mother called. No hello. She said the bank had phoned about a late payment. Surely it was just a mistake with the account. Paige said there was no mistake. She had stopped the autopay. The pause on the line was the longest she had ever heard from her mother. Then the tears arrived, right on schedule. Carol said she didn't understand. She said they were a family and family takes care of family. She said Paige had always been her dependable one. She said she didn't know what had gotten into her. Paige asked very gently whether her father's will took care of family, too. Another pause. Then, the will is your father's business. It has nothing to do with the mortgage. And besides, you don't keep score with your own parents. Family doesn't keep a ledger. Family doesn't keep a ledger. Paige nearly laughed out loud. Because keeping ledgers was literally how she fed herself. And for 8 years, she had been the only one in that family who hadn't kept one. She just paid. She told her mother she loved her. She said they'd talk soon. She hung up before the conversation could turn into the sport her mother was good at and she wasn't. Then Eric got involved. He called with the lazy confidence of someone who had never once worried about a number. He said their mother was a wreck. He asked what her problem was. He mentioned their father's heart, the way you'd lead with your strongest card. Then he said the thing he clearly believed made him the bigger person. He said she had been sending money, sure. But money wasn't everything. He was the one who really showed up. Who called their mom. Who sat with their dad. Who gave them his time while she just transferred funds from a safe distance. He said it like it settled the matter. Paige sat with that for a moment. She thought about who drove the 50 minutes in 38 when their father collapsed in the garden. She thought about who had set up the pill organizer. Who had learned what a beta blocker was. Who had argued with the pharmacy over a prior authorization. She didn't say any of it. Because Eric had already decided the story. And you cannot reconcile an account with someone who refuses to open the book. She asked him one question. If money isn't everything, would you like to start covering the mortgage on the house you're about to inherit? The line went very quiet. Then he laughed, like she'd made a joke, and said they'd talk when she stopped being so dramatic. She hadn't raised her voice once. A few days later, Paige's phone buzzed with a notification from a home renovation app. Months earlier, before any of this had started, Brittany had added her as a collaborator on a shared design board. Paige had forgotten she was even on it. The board was called The Farmhouse. 41 photos. White cabinets. A farmhouse sink. A wall knocked out between the kitchen and the den. Her parents' den. Brittany had already started measuring rooms that sat on a deed with Paige's name on it. And pinned to the very top, a contractor's estimate. $43,000. Demo work, new kitchen, the full renovation. A handwritten caption beneath it said the deposit was due at signing. Eric's note read, "Mom can cover it from savings." The savings page had spent 8 years helping rebuild. They were planning to spend her parents' money she had backfilled for years, to renovate a house she co-owned, as a gift to her brother, while telling the whole town that Paige was the one bleeding the family dry. The last small voice in her that had whispered maybe you're overreacting, maybe just turn the payment back on, went completely quiet. She took a screenshot of the estimate. Added it to a folder. Because Paige kept records. Then one Thursday evening, someone, probably Brittany fumbling with contacts, accidentally added Paige to a group text. The thread was called Mom and Dad House. 4 members. Carol, Raymond, Eric, Brittany. And then, for about 90 seconds before anyone noticed, Paige scrolled up. She read it the way she read a confession. Brittany had written that the contractor could start in spring if the financing held. Her mother had written that Paige would come around. She always came around. She just needed to feel guilty enough. Eric had written a laughing emoji and the words, "She'll fold by Christmas. She can't help herself." And then her father, the man whose stent she had researched, whose medications she had organized, whose discharge papers she had read alone at the kitchen table, had written the line that finished something in her completely. He wrote, "Once the house is Eric's, this stops being her problem anyway." They had a word for her in that thread. And it wasn't daughter. It was a noun you'd find on a bank statement. Paige took a screenshot of every message. Then someone noticed the extra name in the thread. The typing dots appeared and vanished. Eric removed her without a word. But she had it. She had all of it. And for the first time in 8 years, she stopped feeling like the problem. She felt like the person holding the answer. That night, she went to her fireproof box. She spread the closing folder across her kitchen table under the good light. The note from the lender. The settlement statement. The deed. She read it slowly. And there it was. Her name, not as a co-signer doing her parents a favor, but as an owner. A tenant in common. Majority share. The percentages spelled out in plain numbers right there on the recorded document. A will can only pass what a person actually owns. The house her father had promised to his son was on paper, already mostly hers. Had been for 8 years. She called her attorney the next morning, a real estate lawyer named Gwen whose books Paige had kept for years. Gwen read the documents with her glasses pushed up on her head and made the small professional sound of someone whose facts are cleaner than expected. She confirmed, Paige was the majority owner of record. The primary borrower. Her parents could not sell, refinance, or structurally alter the property without Paige's written consent. What are my options? Paige asked. Gwen listed them like a menu. Force a sale and claim her share. Buy out her parents' portion at fair value. Or simply remain the owner she had always been. And let the people planning the farmhouse renovation discover the house wasn't theirs to give. Paige paid the invoice that same day. Then she went home to wait. 1 month almost to the day after the autopay went off, at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning. Before she had even started the coffee, her mother sent the text. No hello. No how's the business. No how are you, sweetheart. Just this. The mortgage is due. Paige stood at her own kitchen counter, in her own paid-for home, and looked at that text for a long time. She thought about 96 payments. She thought about the will and the one sentence that said she had already been provided for. She thought about the group thread where her father had called her a problem that would soon stop being his. Then she typed 4 words. 4 words. And pressed send. Everything goes to Eric. So does the mortgage. She turned the phone face down, poured her coffee, and drank it while it was still hot, which she hadn't managed to do in years. By Sunday, the family had organized dinner with a speed they'd never managed for anything that didn't involve cornering Paige. Her mother had pulled out the good tablecloth. Both table leaves. The pot roast was in the oven before noon. And it wasn't going to be just the 5 of them. Through her cousin Dana, the only one who had called to hear Paige's side of the story, Paige learned that her mother had invited her Aunt Lorraine, 2 cousins, and a neighbor couple who'd been family friends for 30 years. Witnesses. Though Carol would have called them support. The plan was clear. Seat Paige at a table full of people who loved her parents, let Carol dab her eyes, let Raymond sit quietly with his bad heart, and watch the reliable daughter do what she always did. Cave. Apologize. Turn the autopay back on just to make the discomfort stop. It was a good plan. It was the plan that had always worked. They had prepared for every version of Paige, except the real one. She asked Dana to come Sunday. Sit near the back. Keep her phone charged. Why? Dana asked. Because the town group is going to need a correction, Paige said. And I want someone there who remembers it accurately. She spent Saturday night at her kitchen table under the good light, not grieving this time, but preparing. 3 copies of everything. The deed, her name and majority share highlighted in yellow. The settlement statement from the refinance. 8 years of mortgage records, printed in a clean column with a total at the bottom that made even her blink. And Gwen's letter on firm letterhead, confirming in careful lawyer language that Paige was the majority owner of record and that the property could not be sold, refinanced, or structurally altered without her written consent. She slid each set into a plain manila envelope, the same kind she'd used to file the will. She didn't prepare a speech. Speeches can be interrupted. Documents cannot. She arrived at the house at 4:58. 6 cars in the driveway. The smell of pot roast from the door. Her Aunt Lorraine sat with crossed arms. The neighbor couple wore their church faces. Dana was near the back with her phone in her lap. Raymond sat at the head of the table, one hand resting on his chest the way it always did now. Carol clutched a tissue she hadn't used yet. Eric and Brittany sat together on the long side. And Brittany wore the particular brightness of a woman who thinks she's about to get her farmhouse sink. They had set the table for an apology. Every face in that room was arranged to receive one. Paige set her bag down, took off her coat, folded her hands on the tablecloth. She had brought a folder instead. Her mother opened, the way she always did, the practice speech about ungrateful children and aging parents, her voice catching right on cue at the word alone. Aunt Lorraine murmured something like an amen. Raymond stared at the tablecloth. Then Eric stood up. He actually stood, for effect, and looked around the room at his audience. He lowered his voice to something grave. He said it was time Paige heard how this looked from the outside. He said she had cut off her own sick father over money. He said she was punishing her parents for a will that was none of her business. And then he delivered the line. The one they'd all come to watch land. Would you really put your own parents out on the street, over a grudge? The room turned to Paige. This was the moment. The moment the reliable daughter was supposed to fold. She let the question sit in the air until everyone could hear how ugly it was. Then, very quietly, she said that no one was putting anyone on the street. That she had never used those words. Not once. And she asked Eric to tell the room who had actually said that. He couldn't. Because it had been him. The first crack appeared in the plan. Paige reached into her bag. The room watched her hands. She took out 3 folders and slid them down the table. One to her Aunt Lorraine, one to the neighbor couple, one laid flat in front of her father. She told them she'd brought some paperwork. Because her family seemed very interested in fairness that afternoon. And fairness goes better with facts. She kept her voice almost gentle. She explained that 8 years ago, when the bank refused to lend her retired parents a single dollar, she had refinanced the house in her own name to stop the foreclosure. She had been the primary borrower ever since. 96 payments had come out of her business account like clockwork. She asked them to find the Paige-marked deed. She told them what the lawyer had already confirmed. Her name was on the title. Not as a helper. As the majority owner. A will could only give away what a person actually owned. So her father could leave Eric his share, but not hers. And the house they had been planning to remodel and inherit and gift to Eric was on paper already mostly Paige's. She didn't say it with heat. She just let the documents do the talking. And the room went very, very quiet. Eric exploded. He shoved his chair back and said the paper was a trick. That she had manipulated their father into signing something. That no court would ever believe a daughter owned her parents' house. Paige let him run. A man who is losing usually does the work of losing for you. If you stay still. Brittany's face went through 3 colors and landed on white. She watched her farmhouse sink disappear down a drain she didn't understand. Carol turned on the full force of her tears and said Paige had taken advantage of them. But then the retired insurance man, a neighbor who had sat at that table for 30 years, looked up from the deed. He looked at Carol. He said quietly, "Carol, this is recorded. It's real." That landed harder than anything Paige had said. Because it came from one of her mother's own witnesses. And through all of it, Raymond said nothing. He had opened his folder. He was looking at the deed. His hand had come off his chest and gone flat on the table. His face had done something Paige had never seen it do before. It had gone from certain to afraid. He had built his whole identity on a line he'd said twice at 2 different dinner tables. The home goes to the sun. And he was now looking at a piece of paper that had quietly made that line untrue for 8 years while he wasn't watching. He looked up at Paige. For one moment there was no tradition in his eyes. No legacy. No son. Just an old man who had gambled his daughter's loyalty on an assumption that was never written down. Almost, Paige felt sorry for him. When the room ran out of noise, she spoke again. She hadn't raised her voice once. She said she hadn't come to take anyone's home. She had come because the truth had been living in a folder for 8 years, and it was time it sat at the table with the rest of them. Then she gave them 3 doors. Door 1. Her parents stay in the house, under a signed written agreement that defines exactly what each party owns and splits the costs fairly. Door 2. She buys out their share at fair market value. They take the money. They live wherever they choose, free of any mortgage. Door 3. Since the will leaves everything to Eric, the heir to everything, could start paying the mortgage on everything. Beginning the 1st of next month. The choice was theirs. She would put it in writing either way. Her mother, still wet-eyed, said Paige was treating her own family like a transaction. And Paige gave her back her own words. You told me that family doesn't keep a ledger. You were right. For 8 years, I never kept one. I just paid. But the bank keeps a ledger. And my name is the one on it. She let that sit. Then she stood up. Because finished feels different than loud. Nobody stopped her. That was the part she would remember. Not the shouting. The silence after it. When there was nothing left to shout. She put on her coat. Left a signed copy of Gwen's letter next to the cooling pot roast. Told them to let her know which door they wanted. Then she drove the 50 minutes home. Both hands on the wheel. Radio off. And for the first time in 8 years, the quiet in the car wasn't something she was bracing against. It was just quiet. It was hers. They chose door 1. 3 weeks later, lightning fast, for that family. Carol could not bear to leave the house. Raymond could not bear to admit door 2 existed. Gwen drew up the agreement. It spelled out in numbers every party's share, split the costs fairly, put everything in writing, and was signed by everyone whose name was on the deed. Eric refused to contribute a single dollar. Called the whole thing a betrayal. Moved out within the month. The prospect of paying for the house he'd planned to inherit had a way of curing his interest in living in it. Brittany's farmhouse board went private. Then it vanished. The renovation died at the contractor's voicemail. Aunt Lorraine, who had read every page of that deed at the table, quietly told 3 different relatives that maybe they'd had the story backwards. And Dana, sitting near the back with a charged phone like Paige had asked, posted one calm correction to the town community group. Just the facts. No cruelty. And Carol's saga of the cold daughter stopped collecting prayer hands. The casseroles stopped. The story had finally been reconciled against the receipts. And the receipts won. Paige still goes out to the house. That surprises people when she tells them. Her father's heart is still a part-time management job. And she is still the one who reads the discharge papers. Because that's who she is. And she has made her peace with it. But she goes now because she wants to. Not because a payment is due. They talk about his blood pressure and the weather. Almost never about money. Because money finally lives in a signed agreement where it belongs, instead of hanging over every dinner like a bill that nobody will claim. She and her mother are careful with each other. The way you are with something that broke and got glued back together. It holds. But you can see where the crack was. She and Eric don't speak much. She has stopped waiting for that to feel like a wound. Some accounts you close on purpose. And the balance you're left with is peace. She sleeps through the night now. The autopay stays off. And on the 1st of every month, when her phone used to buzz with a number that was somehow always her responsibility, there is just morning. And coffee. And quiet she finally stopped paying for. She learned something in those 8 years that she could not have put into words until she was sitting at that table with a folder in her hands and 12 people waiting for her to apologize. She learned that love, which only ever flows in one direction, is not love at all. It is an invoice nobody ever intends to pay. And you are allowed, at any age, in front of any audience, to stop signing your name to it. That's the story. 8 years. 96 payments. One deed they forgot was real. If this reminded you to actually read the paperwork with your name on it, or to stop funding a seat at a table that never set a place for you, let that be your sign. And by the way, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments. Because it never stops being remarkable how far these stories travel. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.